This is Bill Tinglin with Tour for Tolerance, proud sponsor of this podcast series on the Holocaust. Get ready. This week we take another powerful deep dive into history's darkest hour.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that's pretty dark.
Yeah.
We're talking about the history of eugenics, and I think a lot of people listening are probably familiar with the term. But we're gonna go deep and look at how this whole concept went very, very wrong. And just to give everyone a roadmap for where we're headed, today we're going to be uncovering the origins of eugenics, how this movement spread, and the truly disturbing consequences it had. And we'll talk about how it actually connects to events like the Holocaust.
Right.
And you might be surprised to hear some of the names of the people who got caught up in this movement.
Yeah, it's true. Eugenics is really rooted in a dangerous misapplication of science. Basically, the idea was to manipulate human genetics to create a superior race. And this idea spread all over the world, but its impact was really concentrated in the United States and Nazi Germany.
So how did this whole thing even get started? Like, where did this concept come from?
Well, the term eugenics was actually coined in 1883 by a British scientist named Francis Galton. And this is where things get really interesting. He was a relative of Charles Darwin.
Wait, Darwin? Like the theory of evolution, Darwin? That's a connection I would not have expected.
Yeah, it's kind of a twist. See, Darwin was all about natural selection, the idea that, traits that are beneficial for survival and reproduction get passed down to future generations. But Galton took this concept in a very different and disturbing direction.
So instead of just letting nature take its course, it was about humans deciding who should and shouldn't have children.
Exactly. He got really fascinated by selective breeding. Like how we've bred certain traits in dogs over generations.
Right.
And he thought we could apply the same principles to humans to improve the species.
That's a pretty big leap to make. I mean, breeding dogs for certain looks or temperaments is one thing, but to think you can just apply that to people is unsettling.
Yeah, it is. And what's even more unsettling is how quickly these ideas gained traction in the early 20th century, particularly in the United States.
Really? I mean, it's hard to believe that the U.S., a country that's supposed to be all about individual liberties, that they would embrace these ideas to the point of, enacting laws allowing forced sterilization.
Unfortunately, it's true. Several states actually had laws that allowed the government to sterilize people they deemed unfit to reproduce.
Yeah.
A really shocking example of this is the Buck v. Bell case of 1927.
So the Supreme Court actually ruled that forced sterilization was constitutional.
Yes. In that case, the court upheld a Virginia law that allowed for the sterilization of people considered feeble-minded, which was a very vague and open to interpretation term. And get this, that ruling is technically still on the books today.
Wow, that's it's kind of a chilling reminder of how deep these ideas once were. It's easy to think of eugenics as something that happened, somewhere else, but to think it was happening here in the U.S. and even upheld by the highest court, it's disturbing.
It's a reminder that even ideas that seem scientific can be misused to justify really harmful actions. And this focus on, controlling who reproduces based on their perceived fitness, it ties directly to what happened in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, you're right. We can't talk about eugenics without talking about the Nazis. It's well known that Hitler and his regime were obsessed with creating a master race, and they used eugenics to justify horrific acts of genocide.
Exactly. Hitler was really influenced by Galton's work, and he saw it as a scientific justification for his racist ideology.
And, reading excerpts from Mein Kampf, Hitler's own book, it's chilling. You see him openly praising eugenics and laying out his vision for racial hygiene.
Right.
That term racial hygiene, it's a euphemism that hides the true horror of what he was advocating for.
It was essentially a plan to eliminate anyone deemed undesirable from the German population. This included Jews, people with disabilities, LGBTQ individuals, anyone who didn't fit into his vision of a racially pure society.
And this wasn't just talk. This led to real action.
Absolutely. Shortly after Hitler came to power in 1933, the Nazis enacted the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. This allowed for the forced sterilization of individuals with a whole range of conditions, mental illness, physical disabilities.
So it started with sterilization, which is horrific enough.
Yeah.
But tragically, it didn't stop there. The Nazis went from forced sterilizations to mass murder during the Holocaust.
Right.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of this genocide. Millions of people were murdered because they were deemed unfit by the Nazi regime.
Mm.
And it's important to remember that each victim was a human being with their own life, their own story.
Absolutely. And while the Holocaust is a stark example of the horrors of eugenics, it's important to remember that the human cost of this ideology extends far beyond that event.
You mentioned that the impact of eugenics was particularly strong in the United States and Nazi Germany, but what about how it played out in America?
Well, the United States actually had a pioneering role in the eugenics movement.
Really? I'm a little surprised to hear that. I mean, you'd think a nation founded on principles of equality and liberty would have rejected these ideas.
It's a complicated and often overlooked part of American history. As I mentioned earlier, many states enacted forced sterilization laws in the early 20th century, and these laws disproportionately targeted marginalized communities, including Black Americans, immigrants, people living in poverty.
That's really disturbing. It's clear that eugenics wasn't just about some, abstract notion of improving the human species. It was used as a tool to control and oppress certain groups of people.
Exactly. And the long-lasting impact of these policies is something we're still dealing with today.
So it wasn't just about the sterilizations themselves, but the wider societal implications.
Exactly. The eugenics movement contributed to a culture of fear and prejudice that had far-reaching consequences.
It's amazing how a seemingly scientific idea could be twisted into such a harmful ideology.
It reminds us that we always need to be vigilant against the misuse of science and knowledge.
It's crazy how widespread this was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we talked about how Galton was inspired by dog breeding, but did that idea really influence people like in America who supported this stuff?
Yeah, it did. And it wasn't just dogs either. Livestock breeding was held up as this model. The idea was if you can breed, better cows or faster horses, then why not humans?
Right.
But of course, that totally ignores how complex human genetics really are and the ethics of treating people like animals, just to be bred.
Yeah, it's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of shocking that some of the brightest minds, of that time were actually into this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about people like Winston Churchill, Alexander Graham Bell.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even brilliant people can fall for bad ideas.
Right.
It's easy to look back and judge, but you have to remember these ideas were mainstream back then. It really shows how important it is to think critically no matter who's saying something.
That's a good point. We can't just take something at face value just because someone famous said it. So how did we go from this, widespread acceptance to the horrors of the Holocaust? Was there like a turning point?
Well, the Nazis really embracing eugenics was a big turning point.
Mhm.
Hitler took these ideas that were already distorted and he weaponized them. He used them to justify genocide on a huge scale.
And it wasn't just the Holocaust either.
Right.
It was the sterilization of people with disabilities, the persecution of LGBTQ individuals.
Exactly. It's a chilling reminder that ideas have consequences. And when those ideas are based on prejudice and, fake science, those consequences can be devastating.
It's easy to think of eugenics as something from the past, something that couldn't happen again.
Yeah.
But the reality is that these ideas are still around.
Oh, absolutely. There are still people and groups out there who hold on to these dangerous beliefs about genetic purity and, superiority. And with all the advancements we're seeing in genetics and biotech, the potential for misuse is a real concern.
So what can we do? I mean, how do we prevent history from repeating itself? How do we make sure that science is used for good?
Well, education is key. We need to understand the history of eugenics, the horrors that it led to the flawed thinking behind it. By shining a light on this dark chapter, we can equip ourselves to recognize and challenge these dangerous ideologies if they reappear.
And I think it's also about promoting a culture of critical thinking. Like we were saying earlier, we can't just blindly accept information, especially when it comes to complicated scientific concepts.
Absolutely. We need to be able to ask questions, evaluate evidence, consider different perspectives. And that's really important now more than ever with how easily misinformation can spread.
Yeah. And it's not just about what we do as individuals. We have to hold our institutions accountable too.
Yeah, yes, definitely. We need to make sure that our governments, our universities, our scientific communities are all upholding ethical standards and, promoting responsible research.
This brings up the whole issue of bioethics. The potential for misuse of genetic technology seems huge, even if it's not driven by the same, racist ideology as in the past.
Yeah, that's right. The ethical questions surrounding genetic engineering and gene editing are super complex. We need to have open and honest conversations about the potential benefits and risks of these technologies, and we need to make sure they're used responsibly and fairly.
It's a big challenge, but it's one we can't ignore. The stakes are just too high. What are some of the concerns that you see as like the most pressing right now?
Well, there's a whole debate about designer babies, where parents could potentially pick certain traits for their kids. This brings up concerns about making existing social inequalities even worse and maybe even creating a genetic underclass.
That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But the fact that we're even talking about this shows how fast technology is moving.
It is incredible. We're now able to manipulate the very building blocks of life. It's both exciting and a little terrifying.
It makes me think about those stories of resistance we talked about before. People like Dr. Karl Bonhoeffer, who actively opposed the Nazis. It's inspiring, but it also feels a little overwhelming. What can ordinary people do to combat these larger forces?
It can feel overwhelming for sure. But even small acts of resistance matter. Speaking out against injustice, supporting organizations that are promoting ethical science, educating ourselves and others about these issues. It all contributes to a more just and equitable world.
I think it also comes down to being aware of our own biases and assumptions. We need to question our own beliefs and be open to changing our minds.
You're right. It's about having some humility and realizing that we don't have all the answers.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah.
It's clear that the legacy of eugenics is complicated, and there's a lot to think about.
It is. It reminds us that science is a powerful tool, and it can be used for good or for bad.
And it's up to us to make sure it's used ethically and for the benefit of all humanity. It feels like we've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to this whole history of eugenics and the impact it had.
It's true. We've talked about the big picture stuff. But it's important to remember that this movement affected real people in very real ways.
It's easy to get caught up in the ideas, but we're talking about people's lives, the lives of individuals and families that were changed forever by these policies.
Absolutely. Think about the people who were forcibly sterilized. They were denied the right to have children, often based on really questionable criteria. I mean, the impact of that is just unimaginable.
And it wasn't just those directly affected.
Right.
These policies had ripple effects that went way beyond.
You're exactly right. They created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion. People were afraid to speak up or get help for fear of being labeled unfit.
Earlier you mentioned Dr. Karl Bonhoeffer, who resisted the Nazis. Are there any other stories of resistance that really stand out to you? Stories that give us hope, amidst all this darkness?
Oh, there are many. One that comes to mind is the story of the Hartheim Euthanasia Center in Austria. There was a priest there, Father Franz Reinisch, who refused to give the Nazi salute.
Wow.
And he was executed for his defiance.
That's incredible. It's powerful to see that even in the face of such evil, there were people who wouldn't back down from their principles.
And it wasn't just individuals. There were organizations and groups working against the eugenics movement, too. There were scientists and doctors speaking out against the bad science behind it, and religious groups who sheltered people who were being targeted.
These stories are so important. They show us that even in the darkest times, there's hope. There are always those willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost.
Exactly. They remind us that we have a choice. We can choose to do nothing, or we can choose to act.
It's striking that eugenics appeal to such a wide range of people, scientists, politicians, even people we might consider heroes today. It makes you wonder how something so harmful could become so widely accepted.
Yeah, it shows that even well-intentioned people can be influenced by bad ideas. It really highlights the importance of thinking for ourselves and questioning what we believe, even our own assumptions.
And it's a reminder that we have to look at the context, the historical and social context. Eugenics didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was fueled by prejudice and societal anxieties that already existed.
Absolutely. We have to understand the forces that shape our understanding of science and how those forces can be twisted to serve agendas that are really harmful.
We've covered so much today, from the beginning of eugenics to its terrible consequences, and to those glimmers of hope in the stories of resistance. What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to never forget the lessons of history. The history of eugenics is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the dehumanization of others. It reminds us to always be on guard against ideologies that try to divide us, and to be willing to speak out against injustice even when it's hard.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of eugenics. It's a difficult topic, but one we can't ignore. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning about this. There are lots of resources out there, museums, documentaries, books that can give you a deeper understanding of this complex and challenging history.
Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding the past, we can build a better and more just future for everyone.
Thanks for joining us.